Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I live alone in a small house in a pretty quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles. It's one of those neighborhoods where people kind of keep to themselves, but it's still a decent area. Not too sketchy, but you wouldn't want to leave your car unlocked either. I just finished a late dinner. Nothing fancy, just some leftovers, and was on my couch watching TV. I was zoning out, scrolling through my phone, maybe a little too tired from the work week to care about anything else. It was about 9:45 p.m. when I first heard it. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It started as this faint, almost inaudible noise, what I thought might be a dog whining or maybe someone calling out in the distance, but then it came again, louder this time, almost like a scream, and it definitely wasn't a dog. It sounded like a woman. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from the street or from somewhere nearby, but then I realized it was definitely coming from outside my front door. It was unmistakable, a woman yelling for help. Her voice was filled with terror. "Please, please help me. I'm being chased." It wasn't just the words that freaked me out. It was the urgency, the desperation. I could hear her feet hitting the ground, running, but the way her voice kept cracking, it was like she was in serious distress. For a second, I thought I should call the police, but then something stopped me. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't sit right. Maybe it was because it was so late and no one else in the neighborhood seemed to be reacting. I hadn't heard any cars, any other voices, nothing that would suggest anyone else was around. I crept toward the front door, slowly, trying not to make a sound. I wasn't sure if I should open the door or just call for help myself. There was a moment of hesitation, but then I heard her again, this time even more frantic. "Please, open the door. He's gonna get me. He's right behind me." I didn't recognize the voice, but I could hear the desperation in her tone. It was real. That much was clear. My heart was racing as I thought about what to do. I had a security system, but I didn't have a peephole, which was stupid. My front door is just one of those old wooden ones with a small frosted window on the top left, and the only way to see outside was by opening the door. I was torn. I wanted to help her, but something didn't sit right. It was late, and I didn't know if this was a setup. I've heard stories like this before. People pretending to be in danger just to get someone to open the door, only to rob or hurt them. Still, I couldn't ignore her. I mean, what if she really was in danger? I stood there for what felt like forever, debating with myself. My mind was racing. But in the end, I decided I'd at least crack the door open just enough to see what was going on. I wasn't going to fully open it, not without knowing what I was getting into. So I took a deep breath and slowly turned the handle. The moment I cracked the door, I immediately regretted it. The woman was standing right in front of me. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed, her hair a mess. She looked like she had been running for her life. Her clothes were disheveled, and she was sweating. She looked like she had been through hell, but there was something off. She was standing too still now. Her voice, which had been so frantic just a moment ago, had gone completely quiet. She wasn't even looking at me directly. Her eyes were darting around like she was scanning the area. She seemed more cautious now, like she was trying to assess if anyone else was around. That's when it hit me. This wasn't right. And that's when I heard it. A rustling sound, soft but noticeable, came from behind me. My gut tightened. It sounded like footsteps, but not from inside the house. More like someone was moving around outside, closer than I expected. I turned quickly, but there was no one in the hallway. I glanced back toward the door, and just as I did, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A man stepped out from the shadows at the side of the house. My heart stopped. He wasn't running. He wasn't even in a hurry. It was like he'd been waiting for me to open the door. His calmness was unnerving. He wasn't dressed oddly, just a hoodie and jeans. But there was something about him, his posture, the way he carried himself, that screamed, "This is planned." He was too confident, like he knew exactly what was about to happen. The woman didn't scream, didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at me with this blank expression. No sign of fear, no panic. Everything clicked in that moment. I could feel my blood run cold. It was a setup. There was no one chasing her. She was never in danger. The man had been hiding nearby, waiting for me to open the door. He had planned this. I slammed the door shut and locked it immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the man's footsteps outside, getting closer to the door. He was testing it, trying to see if it was locked, probably figuring out his next move. I didn't know what they were planning. Maybe they were going to rob me, or maybe something worse, but I wasn't about to find out. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called 911. I told them everything about the woman, the man, and what I thought they were trying to do. They told me to stay inside and not to engage with them. I stayed on the phone, my eyes glued to the door, praying they wouldn't try anything else. About 10 minutes later, I heard sirens. The police arrived in no time. When they came to the door, I let them in, and they immediately began searching around the property. They found the man and the woman hiding in the bushes on the side of the house. The woman was definitely in on it. She wasn't in distress at all. She was just playing a role. The police told me they'd been doing this in the area for a while, scamming people by pretending to be victims. They'd choose a house, make up a story about being chased, and hope the person would let them inside. Once they were inside, they'd either rob the person or worse. I don't know what would have happened if I'd opened the door fully, but I'm glad I didn't. Now, whenever I hear any kind of noise outside late at night, I don't even hesitate. I call the police immediately. I've learned that there are some things you can't trust, no matter how real they seem. It all started pretty normal. I was home alone. It was a Thursday evening, just after 6. I'd planned on making a simple dinner, some pasta and sauce, nothing fancy. The sun had just set, and it was one of those quiet evenings where everything seems still. You know what I mean? No cars outside, no people walking by, just peaceful. The kind of peace you take for granted until it's shattered. So there I am, chopping onions, humming to myself, when the power suddenly goes out. 1 second I'm slicing tomatoes, and the next, everything goes pitch black. The lights flickered for a second, then died completely. I froze. I knew the power could go out sometimes, especially with the weather here in California, but this didn't feel right. It wasn't like a storm or anything, just quiet. For a second I thought maybe it was just my lights. You know how sometimes one part of the house goes out and the rest stays lit? I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and checked the circuit breaker in the kitchen. Nothing. It wasn't just me. The whole block must have lost power. I was still trying to wrap my head around it when I heard it. The sound of glass shattering, like something big had been thrown or dropped across the room. It came from the living room. My heart raced. My immediate thought was that maybe I'd left a window open and the wind had blown something off the counter. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Who breaks glass just for fun? I stood there frozen for a second. I couldn't move. The house was quiet again, except for the ringing in my ears. I knew I had to go check it out. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe something fell over, or the cat knocked something off the shelf. But I couldn't ignore that feeling in my gut. You know the feeling, right? When something's just wrong, like your brain is screaming at you that you're not alone. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, mostly out of instinct. I knew it wouldn't really help if someone was in the house, but I had to feel like I could do something. Slowly, I crept into the living room, holding the knife like I was some kind of action hero. I know it sounds dumb now, but in that moment, I just wanted to feel in control. The house was dark, too dark. The only light was from my phone, which I held in my other hand. I shone the light across the room, checking the windows, the furniture. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I saw it. One of the windows in the living room was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. I swear I could feel my blood go cold. I had locked all the windows before, I was sure of it. I always do. But this one was open. The curtains were swaying gently as if someone had just walked out of it. I rushed to the window, barely thinking, trying to get a good look outside. But all I saw were shadows, the streetlights far off in the distance. I couldn't make anything out, but I felt it. I felt like someone had been there. I backed away from the window and stopped dead in my tracks when I heard something upstairs. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing around up there, taking their time. I couldn't believe what was happening. There was no way I was imagining this. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Just standing there, my heart hammering in my chest. I was sure at this point that there was someone in the house. Someone who shouldn't be. I didn't even know what to do. Call the police? Try to leave? I didn't want to risk moving too quickly. I didn't want to make a sound. I tiptoed back down the hallway toward the stairs, still clutching the knife like a lifeline. The footsteps upstairs stopped for a moment, and that's when I heard something that made my stomach flip. A door creaking open. It wasn't just the floorboards. It was a door, the sound of metal hinges screeching. I didn't know which door it was, but the sound was unmistakable. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. There was someone in the house, someone upstairs, someone who had no reason to be there. I darted into the bathroom and locked the door behind me. The phone in my hand was shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. My mind was racing. I could hear the soft footsteps again, closer this time. I tried to steady my breath, but my hands were slick with sweat. 911. I managed to press the numbers, and when the operator answered, I barely got the words out. "Someone's in my house," I whispered. "Please send help. Now." The operator told me to stay on the line, but I barely heard her. My eyes were glued to the bathroom door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. I didn't dare make a sound. I could hear the intruder walking closer, the sound of his feet moving across the floor. But then, it stopped. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing. I kept listening, trying to be as quiet as possible. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement. My breathing was loud, my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind kept running scenarios of what could happen next. I kept thinking I was just going to hear that door handle turn, and then I'd be done for. Then, I heard sirens in the distance. And thank God, the sound of those sirens gave me a little bit of hope. Maybe this wouldn't end as badly as I thought. I stayed in the bathroom, phone pressed to my ear, barely able to speak anymore. I don't know how much time passed before I finally heard the police outside. But I could hear them moving around, yelling at someone, and then I heard a voice. "Come out with your hands up!" It was the officers. Finally, inside the house. When I heard them come in, I felt the tension in my body release for the first time in what felt like hours. The intruder was caught, and I didn't have to face whatever he had planned. I heard the police arrest him and drag him out. They said he'd been watching the house for days, waiting for a chance to break in. He thought I wasn't home. I've never been so thankful to hear those sirens. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, not really. The fear still lingers in the back of my mind whenever I'm alone in my house, but I guess that's just the price you pay for living in a world that can be so unpredictable. I'd recently moved into this small two-bedroom house in California, just outside of the city. It was nothing fancy, but it was mine. The neighborhood was mostly quiet, with the occasional car driving by or a neighbor walking their dog, but that was about it. People were friendly enough, but I didn't know anyone super well. I preferred it that way. Living alone had its perks, and it was peaceful. The evening started off like any other. I was making my way through a true crime documentary when I heard a sound. It wasn't a big noise, just a small, almost subtle noise at first. It sounded like a soft rattle, but it came from the direction of my front door. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind. My front door was old, and the frame had started to shift a little since I moved in. So it creaked sometimes when the temperature changed, or when there was a gust of wind. But this wasn't wind. It was something else. It was the sound of a door handle turning, like someone was trying to open it. I froze. My heart started beating a little faster. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one was supposed to come over. I wasn't expecting deliveries or anything. The only thing I could think of was maybe it was one of my neighbors and I'd just missed their knock, or maybe they'd forgotten their keys or something. Still, I didn't move right away. I wanted to be sure of what I was hearing. The rattling stopped, but then it came again, this time more persistent. The sound of the door handle shaking and turning like someone was trying to get in. I couldn't tell if they were just testing the lock or if they were actually trying to break in. My stomach dropped. I quietly got up from the couch and made my way to the hallway where I had a small hallway closet. Inside, I kept a flashlight and a crowbar just in case. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and tiptoed toward the front door, trying to be as quiet as possible. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rattling stopped for a second, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps, like someone was pacing just outside my door. My heart was racing now. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if I should call the police yet, or wait to see if they'd leave. But what if they weren't alone? What if there was more than one person? I didn't want to take that chance. I quietly backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, holding it to my ear as I slowly dialed 911. I didn't want to make a sound. The operator picked up almost immediately, and I whispered as quickly as I could. "There's someone trying to break into my house," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm home alone, and they're outside my front door. I don't know what to do." The operator asked me a few questions, but I couldn't focus on them. My eyes kept darting toward the door. Was someone there? Could they hear me? I was still whispering when the door handle rattled again, this time more violently, like the person was desperate to get in. I jumped back and pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The light from my flashlight was barely visible through the crack under the door, and I prayed they hadn't noticed. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they moved away from the door, toward the side of the house. I heard a faint scraping sound, like something was being dragged along the wall, and then there was nothing. Complete silence. I couldn't believe what was happening. Was this it? Had they given up? I didn't move for what felt like forever. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, trying to listen for any sign of the intruder. The operator had stayed on the line, comforting me, telling me that help was on the way. I wanted to open the door, look outside, and see if I could figure out who it was, but I didn't dare. I was too scared. Every nerve in my body was on edge. I didn't know if I was in immediate danger or if they were still out there watching, waiting for me to slip up. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to make a move. I quietly set the flashlight down, still holding my phone in one hand, and crept toward the light switch near the front door. Maybe, if I turned on the porch light, I could scare them off. At the very least, I'd get a better look at who was out there. I hesitated for a second, trying to gather my courage, and then I flipped the switch. The light came on, casting a wide pool of bright light over the front porch and yard. For a few seconds, there was nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, trying to see through the dark shadows outside. I felt a little more confident, but I still didn't want to get too comfortable. Then, suddenly, I saw him. A man was standing just a few feet from the porch, frozen in the light. His face was pale and his eyes widened when the light flicked on. For a split second, we both just stared at each other. I wasn't sure if he was shocked or angry, but I didn't want to give him a chance to act. Without thinking, I quickly slammed the deadbolt shut, backed away from the door, and dialed 911 again. "Please, please send someone," I whispered into the phone. "He's right there." The man started to move. He backed away from the door slowly, looking behind him like he was trying to make a run for it. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted down the porch stairs, disappearing into the night. I heard the sound of his footsteps fading as he ran off, but I didn't let myself relax until I heard the sirens in the distance. It felt like hours before the police finally arrived, though it was probably only about 10 minutes. They combed the area around my house, but there was no sign of the man. After a little while, one of the officers came back, saying they found him a few blocks away, hiding behind a bush in someone else's yard. Apparently, he'd been trying to break into a few houses that night, and he had stolen a few things from another house down the street. They arrested him without incident. He was just lucky I had caught him before he could get inside. I was shaken for the next few days. Even though I didn't get hurt, the fact that someone had been on my porch trying to get into my house made me feel completely vulnerable. The police told me I'd done the right thing by staying quiet, calling them, and turning on the light to scare him off. Still, I'll never forget the feeling of hearing that door handle turn, the footsteps pacing outside, and the utter fear that someone was right outside trying to get in. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a bad dream, it was a real person who thought my house was empty, but I was there, and that's what saved me. It was a quiet evening, the kind of evening where the sun had just set, leaving the sky with a soft orange glow. The air was warm enough to keep the house comfortable, but outside, everything felt eerily still. It was the kind of evening where you feel like you're the only one awake in the whole world, and the usual noise of the day had faded into silence. I just finished making myself a cup of coffee and was settling in for a quiet night when I heard a knock at my front door. It was unexpected. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I didn't recognize the sound of footsteps. My car was parked in the driveway, so it couldn't be someone looking for me. I figured it was probably one of the neighbors or maybe someone selling something. I walked over and peeked through the peephole. A man was standing there, dressed in a plain t-shirt and jeans, holding a clipboard in one hand and a set of car keys in the other. He didn't look out of the ordinary, just a guy in his 30s, average height, with short dark hair and a scruffy beard. His expression seemed a bit anxious, but nothing that immediately set off alarm bells. "Hello?" I called out from the other side of the door. I didn't want to open it just yet, but I didn't want to be rude either. "Hey, I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice sounding strained. "My car broke down a few blocks away and my phone died. I was wondering if I could use yours to call a tow truck. It'll only take a minute, I swear." I hesitated. The request seemed odd, but it wasn't out of the question. Still, I wasn't sure how to respond. I didn't want to be that person who turned someone away just because they seemed a little off. Worst case, I'd let him make a quick call and be on his way. But then I remembered the stories I'd heard about people getting scammed or worse in the neighborhood. It was a quiet area, but there had been some reports about strangers looking for opportunities to break into homes, or worse. "Sorry," but I'm really not comfortable letting strangers in, I said, still not opening the door. Can I just call someone for you instead? He sighed, like he was a little frustrated, but not overly so. His tone was calm, but there was something behind it that I couldn't quite place. I get it, he said. I just don't know anyone around here. I've been trying to get a tow for the last hour, and I'm just stuck. I'd really appreciate it if you could just let me use your phone for a minute. Please. I could hear the urgency in his voice now, but it still wasn't enough to set off any major alarms. He sounded like someone genuinely in a bad situation, but I wasn't comfortable letting him inside. I can't let you inside, I said, trying to sound firm. But if you want, you can use my phone out here. I'll just pass it through the door. There was a long pause. Then I saw his hand reach up to the door, his fingers brushing against the doorknob. He was stepping a little closer than I'd expected. Something about the movement made me feel uneasy. I unlocked the door slowly, leaving the chain on, just in case. I cracked it open enough to hand him my phone. Here, I said, holding it out. Just be quick with it, okay? But when he reached for it, his grip was too eager, too fast. There was a sharpness in his movements that hadn't been there before. I instinctively pulled the phone back, but he didn't let go right away. I really need it, please, he insisted, his eyes widening slightly. The urgency in his voice was different now, more desperate. I froze. My gut tightened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. His demeanor had shifted, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what felt wrong. He wasn't just a guy stranded by the side of the road anymore. Look, I said, my voice sharper now. I can't let you in. You can make the call from the porch, but that's all I can do. His face tightened. For a brief moment, something dark crossed his eyes. Was it anger or calculation? I couldn't tell. But whatever it was, it made my heart skip a beat. His posture shifted, and I noticed something else. That's when I saw it. A bulge in his jacket pocket. At first, I thought it was just his phone or maybe some keys, but then I saw the outline of something hard and metal. A knife. My blood ran cold. I quickly stepped back, yanking the door shut with all my strength. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking as I slammed the door. The chain rattled as it caught, but I didn't care. I couldn't move fast enough. For a second, I heard him mutter something, words I couldn't make out. They sounded like a mix of frustration and maybe a threat. But I didn't stay to listen. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the house, making sure all the windows were closed and the other doors locked. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling, and dialed 911 as quickly as I could. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked, her voice calm and steady. There's a man at my door, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He's trying to force his way in. He said his car broke down, but I think he was lying. I don't know what to do. Stay inside, lock all doors, and do not open the door to anyone, the operator instructed. We'll send an officer immediately. I barely heard her words. My mind was racing. Did I lock the back door? I couldn't remember. What if there were more people outside? Or worse, what if someone was waiting for me to make a mistake? I glanced at the door. It was silent now, too silent. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Then I heard it, a faint tapping. So soft, I almost convinced myself it was nothing. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold, and then a heavy thud. Someone was at the door, or worse, trying to get through it. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't tell if the sounds were coming from the man trying to break in, or if I was imagining it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. It felt like an eternity before I heard another knock at the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but this time it wasn't him. It was the police. I stayed inside, not daring to open the door until I heard the officer's voice through the intercom. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I cracked the door open just enough to see him. His face was tense, and there was a look of relief in his eyes when he saw me. "The man you were talking about? We found him nearby," he said. "He was carrying tools for breaking into houses. He's been trying to break into homes in this neighborhood." I swallowed hard, my legs feeling like jelly. I could barely speak. "They found him?" I whispered. "Yeah, he's in custody now." The officer paused, his tone softening. "You did the right thing by calling us. You were safe." I nodded, still in shock, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. I kept thinking about how close I had come to letting him inside. What if I'd opened the door more? What if I hadn't been as cautious? The thought made my skin crawl. The man who had knocked on my door wasn't who he said he was. He wasn't stranded. He wasn't innocent. And I wasn't sure if I would have made it out of that situation if I'd been any less careful. I live in a small house out in the suburbs of California. It's nothing fancy, just a two-story with a small yard surrounded by a few other houses, but there's a lot of space between them. It's kind of nice in that way. People don't bother you much out here. My family was away for the weekend, my parents were on a trip, and I was left alone. I've been alone plenty of times before. Never bothered me. I'm used to it. But that night, I swear something was off. It all started around 9 p.m. I was on the couch, scrolling through my phone, maybe watching a video or two. I wasn't really paying attention to the time. The house was still, almost too still. You know how everything feels quieter when you're alone? No background chatter, no sounds of the fridge running or someone moving around, just silence. Then I heard it, a faint crunch, like gravel underfoot. I froze. It was coming from outside, just beyond my window. My heart skipped a beat. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something small. But then it came again, louder. A slow, deliberate crunching of gravel, like someone walking, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just hearing things, but I couldn't. It was too real, too clear. It was coming from the gravel driveway right outside the window of the living room. I tried to distract myself, but the sound kept going, like whoever was out there was walking in circles. The sound would move a little, then stop for a second, only to start again. I was starting to feel uneasy. I'm not the type to panic easily, but my gut was telling me that something was wrong. I decided to get up and check. The moment I stood up, I felt that cold chill run down my spine. It's hard to explain, but it was like my body knew something wasn't right before I did. I walked over to the window, careful not to make a sound. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. I peered out through the blinds, but it was dark, and all I could see was the vague outline of the driveway and the front yard. The moonlight barely lit up the gravel, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I thought about calling the cops right then, but I didn't want to overreact. I mean, it was probably just someone walking by, right? But then I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. That's when I felt my stomach drop. I'd lived in this house for a while, and the only people who came this far down the road were neighbors or delivery people. And it wasn't delivery day. I backed away from the window, trying to stay out of sight. My mind was racing now. What if it was someone casing the place? What if they were trying to break in? The thought hit me hard. It wasn't the first time I'd heard stories about break-ins happening in the area, but it still felt so unreal. I waited a few minutes, listening. The footsteps continued, getting closer, until I was certain they were right outside my door. I don't know why I didn't just call the cops immediately. Maybe I thought it was nothing. Maybe I was too scared to face the reality that someone was lurking so close. But then it stopped. I felt a slight sense of relief, thinking whoever it was had finally moved on. But that feeling didn't last. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not alone, even if you're physically the only one in the room. That's when I heard something else. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A tapping like fingers on wood. My front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I stayed completely still, just listening. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't dare move. If this was someone trying to break in, I didn't want them to hear me. But then the tapping stopped, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving toward the side of the house. Slowly, cautiously, like they were trying to be as quiet as possible. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't just sit there, but I didn't want to confront this person alone either. My phone was on the table in the next room, charging. I knew I had to get to it, but I was terrified that if I moved, they would hear me. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, even though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, finally, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A door handle turning. The back door. At that point, panic set in. Someone was trying every door and window, testing if they were unlocked. The thought made my stomach churn. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed the police. I could barely hold the phone with my shaking hands. When the dispatcher answered, I whispered, "Someone's trying to break in." The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and stay hidden. My mind raced, but I kept my eyes fixed on the back door. The sound of the handle turning again, this time accompanied by a small creak, made me freeze. I thought for sure that was it, that they were coming in. But then, just as quietly as it had started, the sound stopped. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for the cops to arrive. Every sound around me seemed to magnify. But finally, after what felt like forever, I heard the sirens in the distance. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the house was empty. The doors and windows were all still locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. But when the officers went outside to check the yard, they found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the gravel. A trail that led away from the house toward the woods behind my property. And in the distance, near an abandoned barn at the edge of the property line, they saw something else. A figure, moving quickly through the darkness, too far away to catch in time. The cops immediately set off in that direction, but the figure had already disappeared into the woods. They searched the area for hours, but they never found the person. They said it was likely someone who had been scouting houses in the area, looking for an opportunity. They also speculated that whoever it was probably didn't know for sure whether the house was empty that night, but they were trying their luck. It was possible the person had been watching my house, waiting for the right moment. That night, I learned just how vulnerable you can be in your own home. The thought that someone was lurking just beyond the walls, like waiting for the perfect moment to strike, is something I'll never shake. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.